There are figures the world remembers, and then there are figures the world never agrees on. Michael Jackson belongs to the second kind. Decades after his voice fell silent, the argument never did. Admiration and suspicion exist side by side, unable to cancel each other out. The same name evokes awe in one room and discomfort in another, and no amount of time has settled it. That alone tells you something is unresolved. Most legacies soften with distance, details blur, emotions cool, consensus forms. But this story hardened instead. Every attempt to simplify it only deepened the divide. Every documentary, every defense, every accusation seemed to push people further into certainty, without ever bringing them closer to agreement. That is not normal. What makes this mystery so enduring is not just what happened, but how impossible it feels to hold all the pieces at once. A child pushed into global fame before identity could form. An artist who reshaped music, performance, and celebrity itself. A private life hidden behind gates, mythology, and contradiction. And somewhere inside that collision, truth became fragmented. People often ask whether Michael Jackson was misunderstood or protected, whether he was exploited or enabled, whether the world failed him, or whether he failed the world. But those questions assume there is a single answer waiting to be uncovered. What if the reason this story never settles is because it refuses to be singular? Because some stories aren't mysteries due to missing facts. They're mysteries because the facts refuse to align neatly. This is not about defending or condemning. It's about understanding why the same evidence produces opposite convictions and why, even now, the world cannot agree on what Michael Jackson truly represents. Once you step into that question, the division starts to make sense. And that's where this story really begins. The division did not begin after Michael Jackson's death. It existed while he was alive, quietly forming beneath the surface of admiration. The difference was that while he lived, the world deferred judgment. After he died, judgment had nowhere left to go. Michael Jackson was not just famous. He was formative. He entered people's lives before they had language for complexity. His music arrived during childhood, adolescence, moments of joy and escape. That timing matters because it binds memory to emotion. When something shapes you early, it resists reclassification later. This is one reason the debate feels personal. To some, questioning Michael Jackson feels like questioning a part of their own past. To others, defending him feels like ignoring harm that should never be minimized. These positions are not just intellectual, they are emotional identities. And once identity enters the conversation, neutrality disappears. But the roots of this division go deeper than loyalty or outrage. Michael Jackson's life unfolded under conditions that distort normal judgment. He was placed into global visibility before he could develop privacy, autonomy, or adult boundaries. His childhood did not end gradually, it was interrupted. Responsibility arrived without choice. Adoration arrived without protection. That environment does not excuse anything, but it does complicate everything. Because when development is disrupted that early, adulthood does not look ordinary. Emotional reference points shift. Relationships form under abnormal dynamics. What feels strange to outsiders may feel normal internally, not because it is healthy, but because it is familiar. This is where the story becomes difficult to hold. Michael Jackson existed at the intersection of innocence and power. He cultivated childlike imagery while wielding extraordinary influence. He sought control over his environment while expressing longing for lost childhood. These contradictions did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, and coexistence is uncomfortable. The public wants coherence, a villain or a victim, a monster or a misunderstood artist. Michael Jackson offered neither. His life produced evidence that supported opposing interpretations simultaneously. And instead of resolving that tension, the world split along it. Media coverage intensified this split. Sensationalism thrives on certainty. It rewards extremes. Nuance does not travel well through headlines. Each new revelation was framed to confirm an existing position rather than challenge it. Those who believed in his innocence saw persecution. Those who believed in his guilt saw validation. In that environment, facts stopped functioning as common ground. They became ammunition. Legal outcomes did little to settle the matter. Acquittals were interpreted as proof of innocence or proof of systemic failure. Settlements were framed as pragmatic decisions or implicit admissions. The same events were read through entirely different moral lenses. This is why time did not heal the debate. Instead of distance providing clarity, it removed the one element that might have resolved it. Michael Jackson himself. He could no longer speak, explain, contradict, or evolve. The story froze at the moment of his death, and interpretation filled the silence. Documentaries, memoirs, and investigations that followed did not converge toward truth. They polarized further. Each side felt more certain, not because new information was definitive, but because it aligned with what they already believed. That is a warning sign. When a story produces increasing certainty without increasing agreement, the issue is no longer evidence alone. It is framework. People are asking different questions, measuring different harms, and prioritizing different values. Some focus on artistic legacy, others on moral responsibility. Some prioritize due process, others prioritize belief in testimony. These are not disagreements that facts alone can resolve because they are rooted in values. Michael Jackson's mystery persists because it exposes those value conflicts. How do we weigh genius against harm? How do we judge behavior shaped by abnormal upbringing? How do we reconcile cultural impact with private conduct? How do we treat allegations when the accused is no longer alive? There is no universal answer to these questions. And because there is no shared hierarchy of values, consensus becomes impossible. What makes this especially difficult is that Michael Jackson was not peripheral to culture. He was central. His work shaped music, fashion, performance, and the global idea of celebrity. Removing him cleanly from that history feels artificial. Defending him uncritically feels irresponsible. So the world remains divided, not because the truth is unknowable, but because the truth does not resolve into a single, comfortable narrative. It forces people to sit with contradiction, and most people are not equipped to do that publicly. This is why conversations about Michael Jackson escalate so quickly. They are not about him alone. They are about what people believe justice should look like, about whether art can be separated from the artist, about how society treats victims, icons, and complexity. Michael Jackson became the container for all of that. And until those deeper questions are addressed honestly, the mystery will continue, not as a lack of information, but as a refusal to accept that some stories remain morally unresolved. That unresolved tension is not a failure of memory. It is the reason the world is still arguing. As the debate hardened, another layer of the mystery became impossible to ignore. The role of the world itself in shaping both Michael Jackson and the way his story is judged. Because this is not only a story about an individual, it is a story about scale, about what happens when a human being becomes too large for ordinary moral frameworks. Michael Jackson was not treated like a person early in life. He was treated like an asset, a phenomenon, a source of revenue, pride, and spectacle. Decisions about his life were made based on productivity, not development. His needs were managed, not nurtured. That distinction matters. When childhood is structured around performance, identity forms differently. Boundaries blur. Approval becomes survival. Love becomes conditional. These conditions do not disappear with age. They calcify. They shape how intimacy is understood, how trust is built, and how control is exercised. Again, this does not excuse harm, but it explains distortion. Michael Jackson grew up in an environment where adults failed to act as adults. Authority figures were inconsistent, exploitative, or absent. Normal corrective experiences, privacy, peer relationships, gradual autonomy were replaced by rehearsal, travel, and adoration. This creates a paradoxical outcome. On one hand, immense power. On the other, arrested development. Michael Jackson could command global attention while remaining emotionally unequipped for ordinary adult life. That imbalance is rare, and it produces behavior that looks inexplicable when judged by standard expectations. This is where public confusion deepened. Some people saw vulnerability and concluded innocence. Others saw power and concluded danger. Both perspectives were reacting to different aspects of the same contradiction. The world struggles to hold those aspects together. Compounding this was Michael Jackson's deliberate retreat from normal social structures. He built environments that insulated him from scrutiny, regulation, and contradiction. Not necessarily because he intended harm, but because isolation felt safer than engagement, familiar than correction. Isolation protects the isolated, but it also removes safeguards. Safeguards matter most when power is uneven. This is where the moral fault lines become sharpest. Critics argue that regardless of his own trauma, Michael Jackson had a responsibility to maintain boundaries. Defenders argue that he lacked the internal framework to understand those boundaries in the same way. Both arguments contain truth. And that is precisely the problem. The justice system attempted to resolve this tension through legal process. But legal standards are not designed to answer moral complexity. They determine guilt beyond reasonable doubt, not coherence of character. They assess evidence, not emotional distortion. So when courts ruled, the moral argument did not end. Acquittal did not equal exoneration in the public mind, nor did allegation equal guilt. The legal outcome answered one question and left many others intact. Those unanswered questions migrated into culture, media, and memory. After Michael Jackson's death, the imbalance worsened. Death removes accountability, but also removes defense. It freezes identity. It prevents growth, apology, or clarification. The person becomes a symbol onto which others project unresolved feelings. In Michael Jackson's case, projection intensified. Some projected nostalgia and loss. Others projected anger and betrayal. Both sides felt morally justified. This is why posthumous narratives became more extreme. Without a living subject to complicate the story, positions hardened. Each new account was absorbed into existing belief systems rather than evaluated independently. Documentaries amplified this effect. Visual storytelling creates emotional truth even when factual truth is contested. Testimony becomes experience. Experience becomes conviction. For viewers, belief feels immediate and personal. For others, the same material feels manipulative and incomplete. The medium itself deepened division. Another factor rarely discussed openly is fear. Fear of being wrong. To defend Michael Jackson fully risks appearing to dismiss victims. To condemn him fully risks erasing nuance and due process. People sense this risk intuitively, so they cling tightly to positions that feel morally safe within their social context. Safety replaces inquiry. Once inquiry stops, the mystery becomes permanent. Michael Jackson's legacy now exists in parallel realities. In one, he is an unparalleled artist whose life was destroyed by exploitation and suspicion. In another, he is a powerful figure whose behavior demands moral reckoning regardless of artistic achievement. There is little overlap between these realities, and the longer they exist separately, the harder it becomes to bridge them. Any attempt to introduce complexity is read as betrayal by one side or evasion by the other. Silence is interpreted as complicity, nuance as cowardice. This is the final consequence of unresolved contradiction. The story no longer invites understanding. It demands allegiance. Michael Jackson became a mirror for how society handles discomfort. Whether we can tolerate ambiguity, whether we can separate empathy from absolution, whether we can hold admiration and accountability at the same time, most public discourse is not built for that level of tension. So the mystery remains, not because answers don't exist, but because the answers are incompatible with the way we prefer stories to end. We want clarity, we want closure, we want moral certainty. Michael Jackson's life offers none of those cleanly. Instead, it offers a collision between power and damage, genius and vulnerability, evidence and interpretation. A collision that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about celebrity, justice, and our own need for simple narratives. That is why the world remains divided. Not because it doesn't know what happened, but because knowing does not resolve what it means. As the years passed, the division around Michael Jackson stopped being about new information and started being about emotional investment. By this point, the mystery was no longer driven by facts alone. It was sustained by what people needed the story to mean. This is where the conflict becomes cultural. Michael Jackson's music is not neutral. It is woven into memory, weddings, childhood car rides, first dances, moments of escape. For millions of people, his work is tied to innocence, joy, and identity. When accusations collide with those memories, the threat feels personal. It's not just an artist being questioned, it's a piece of one's own past. That emotional bond creates resistance. On the other side, there are people for whom the allegations represent something larger than one individual. They symbolize systemic failure, a pattern where powerful figures are protected, where victims are doubted, where charisma shields accountability. For them, defending Michael Jackson feels like repeating a familiar injustice. This is why conversations become hostile so quickly. People aren't debating evidence, they're defending meaning. Once meaning hardens, evidence becomes secondary. It is filtered, weighted, or dismissed based on which emotional narrative it supports. This doesn't make people dishonest. It makes them human. But it does make resolution nearly impossible. Another layer deepened the divide: the absence of a definitive moral authority. In many historical cases, time produces consensus. Documents emerge, witnesses corroborate, institutions acknowledge failure, apologies are issued. In Michael Jackson's case, none of these arrived cleanly. Investigations ended inconclusively. Accounts conflicted. Motivations were questioned on all sides. Ambiguity remained. Ambiguity is destabilizing. It forces people to decide what standard they trust most. Legal outcomes, personal testimony, pattern recognition, emotional intuition, different people prioritize different standards. And once chosen, those standards become identity markers. That choice creates camps. One camp emphasizes due process and the presumption of innocence. Another emphasizes belief in testimony and recognition of power imbalance. Both frameworks exist to prevent harm, but when applied to the same case, they can point in opposite directions. Michael Jackson's story sits exactly at that intersection. This is why attempts to settle the debate often fail. Any conclusion that satisfies one framework violates the other. And in a polarized culture, frameworks are defended fiercely because they reflect moral self-image. Another factor complicates things further: Michael Jackson's deliberate cultivation of mystery. Throughout his life, he controlled access, shaped narrative, and blurred boundaries between reality and fantasy. He presented himself as childlike, otherworldly, and misunderstood. This wasn't just branding, it was insulation. It kept the world at a distance while inviting fascination. But mystery, once established, becomes difficult to dismantle. When questions arise, mystery invites speculation rather than clarity. Silence is interpreted. Eccentricity is reframed. Normal markers of accountability feel absent. The lack of transparency feeds both defense and suspicion. Supporters see persecution of someone who never fit norms. Critics see evasion enabled by fame. Both interpretations are reinforced by the same behavior. After his death, this dynamic intensified. Without Michael Jackson present, narrative control shifted entirely to others. Media, filmmakers, commentators, and audiences competed to define his meaning. Each retelling emphasized certain elements and omitted others. Fragmentation increased. At this stage, the mystery stopped belonging to Michael Jackson. It belonged to the world debating him. The argument became self-sustaining. Each side reacted not to the original events, but to the opposing side's interpretation. This is a critical shift. When a debate becomes reactive, it no longer moves toward truth. It moves toward entrenchment. Positions harden, language sharpens, curiosity disappears. That is exactly what happened here. Any attempt to express uncertainty is attacked. Any attempt to hold complexity is dismissed as evasive. The space between defense and condemnation collapses. People are asked to choose. And choosing feels safer than sitting with discomfort. What's often overlooked is that Michael Jackson's story forces society to confront its own contradictions. We celebrate exceptional talent while ignoring the conditions that produce it. We elevate individuals while stripping them of ordinary development. We demand perfection from people we refuse to protect. Then, when harm is alleged, we struggle to reconcile our role in creating the environment that allowed it. This discomfort fuels denial on one side and absolutism on the other. Michael Jackson becomes a symbol not just of celebrity, but of collective failure. Failure to safeguard children, failure to regulate power, failure to handle ambiguity with integrity. Symbols are heavy. They attract projection. That projection keeps the mystery alive. Because as long as the story serves as a proxy for broader anxieties about fame, justice, memory, and morality, it cannot settle. Resolution would require addressing not just Michael Jackson's actions, but the systems that enabled everything around him. That is a far more difficult task. So the world continues arguing, not because it lacks information, but because it lacks a shared framework for interpreting it. Not because people are unwilling to listen, but because listening threatens deeply held beliefs about fairness, identity, and trust. This is why new generations inherit the debate instead of answers. They encounter the music first, then the allegations, then the division, and they are asked to decide what kind of moral reasoning they believe in, often without realizing that's what they're doing. Michael Jackson's mystery endures because it is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a tension to be managed, a reminder that some stories resist closure because closure would require society to grow in ways it has not yet achieved. Until then, the divide remains, not loud, not explosive, but persistent. A quiet argument passed down through culture, asking the same unresolved question again and again, not just about Michael Jackson, but about how we handle brilliance, power, and harm when they collide. By this stage, the mystery surrounding Michael Jackson was no longer sustained by uncertainty alone. It was sustained by incompatibility. Two versions of reality had formed, each internally consistent, each emotionally coherent, and each unable to absorb the other without collapsing. This is the point where division becomes permanent. What makes Michael Jackson's case uniquely resistant to resolution is that it sits at the intersection of three forces that rarely coexist without conflict: extreme childhood trauma, unprecedented global power, and allegations that demand moral clarity. Each of these elements changes how the others are interpreted. If you emphasize trauma, power feels contextualized. If you emphasize power, trauma feels insufficient. If you emphasize allegations, everything else feels secondary. There is no way to prioritize one without diminishing another. That tension does not resolve with time, it deepens. Another overlooked element at this stage is institutional failure. Not failure in one direction, but failure everywhere. Adults who should have protected a child did not. Systems that should have regulated power did not. Media that should have investigated responsibly often sensationalized instead. Legal processes addressed criminal guilt, but not ethical ambiguity. No single institution absorbed responsibility fully. When responsibility is fragmented, accountability becomes unclear. And when accountability is unclear, public judgment fills the gap. That judgment is rarely uniform. It reflects fear, loyalty, anger, nostalgia, and moral self-preservation. Michael Jackson became the site where all of that accumulated. This is why even factual discussions feel unstable. Evidence is not evaluated in a vacuum. It is evaluated through trust, or lack of it. Trust in institutions, trust in media, trust in testimony, trust in systems that have historically failed vulnerable people. Different communities carry different histories of trust. For some, the justice system's verdicts carry weight. For others, those verdicts are reminders of how often power escapes consequence. For some, media narratives feel manipulative. For others, they feel like overdue exposure. These differences are not intellectual disagreements. They are lived experiences shaping interpretation. As a result, Michael Jackson's story stopped being about what happened and became about which systems people believe in. That shift is subtle but decisive. Once belief in systems enters the equation, persuasion becomes almost impossible. No amount of evidence can overcome a lack of trust. Another factor hardened the divide further: the impossibility of proportional response. Michael Jackson's cultural impact was so vast that any moral judgment felt disproportionate in one direction or another. Condemnation felt like erasing history. Defense felt like erasing harm. There was no action that felt correct to everyone. This created paralysis. Institutions avoided definitive stances. Awards continued to be celebrated or quietly removed. Tributes occurred alongside disclaimers. Radio stations played music selectively. Each decision appeared inconsistent because it was attempting to balance incompatible demands. The result was ambiguity institutionalized, and ambiguity, when prolonged, does not create neutrality. It creates tension that seeps into public consciousness. People sense that something unresolved is being managed rather than addressed. That sense fuels speculation and moral anxiety. Another crucial element here is generational distance. Younger audiences encounter Michael Jackson differently. They did not grow up with him as a living presence. They encounter him through retrospectives, controversies, and debates already shaped by polarization. For them, the mystery is not personal memory. It is inherited conflict. That inheritance matters. Without direct emotional attachment, younger audiences often approach the story with different priorities. Power dynamics stand out more clearly. Historical context is evaluated more critically. Nostalgia carries less weight. At the same time, distance can reduce empathy for the conditions that shaped his development. This generational shift does not resolve the mystery. It reframes it. Older generations feel their experience is being invalidated. Younger generations feel past loyalty is obstructing accountability. Each side perceives the other as morally compromised rather than differently situated. This deepens division rather than healing it. Michael Jackson's absence amplifies all of this because he is not here to evolve, respond, age, or demonstrate accountability or reflection. His identity is fixed at the moment of death. Static figures invite projection more easily than living ones. Living people complicate narratives. Dead icons freeze them. So the story cannot mature. No apology can arrive. No clarification can be offered. No contradiction can emerge from the source. Everything that happens now is interpretation layered on interpretation. At this point, even language becomes contested. Words like allegation, accusation, victim, genius, abuse, exploitation carry different weights depending on who uses them. People argue not just over facts, but over vocabulary. That is a sign of deep fracture. When language itself becomes disputed, dialogue slows. People retreat into familiar phrases and moral shorthand. Conversations become repetitive. No one learns anything new, but positions feel reinforced. This is where fatigue sets in. Many people disengage entirely, not because the issue no longer matters, but because the conflict feels unsolvable. Silence returns, not as resolution, but as avoidance. The mystery remains, but fewer people attempt to unpack it honestly. Yet avoidance does not erase impact. Michael Jackson's work continues to circulate. His influence continues to shape music and performance. His image continues to appear in culture. Each appearance reactivates the unresolved question: can something be celebrated while remaining morally unsettled? That question has no stable answer. Some choose separation, art here, artists there. Others reject separation as ethical evasion. Both approaches are attempts to manage discomfort, not eliminate it. And discomfort persists because the story resists closure by design. Not because of conspiracy or concealment, but because it exposes limits in how society handles contradiction. We prefer linear narratives. Michael Jackson's life was not linear. We prefer moral clarity. His story offers moral collision. We prefer endings. This story stopped without one. By this stage, the mystery no longer belongs to Michael Jackson as a person. It belongs to culture as a test case, a case that reveals how we process fame, trauma, power, testimony, and memory when they refuse to align neatly. That is why the world remains divided, not because people are unwilling to agree, but because agreement would require simplifying something that is structurally complex. And once a story becomes structurally complex, division is not a failure of understanding. It is the consequence of honesty. And that question, once opened, does not easily close. Michael Jackson's story endures not because the world lacks information, but because it lacks a single moral framework capable of holding everything he represents at once. He was shaped by exploitation and gifted with unprecedented power. He inspired wonder while provoking discomfort. He remains legally unresolved and culturally unavoidable. Every attempt to simplify his legacy strips away something essential, and that is why agreement never comes. This is not a mystery that waits for one final revelation. It is a mirror showing how society handles genius, trauma, belief, and accountability when they collide instead of align. How quickly certainty replaces curiosity. How often complexity is rejected in favor of sides. Michael Jackson doesn't divide the world because the truth is hidden. He divides it because the truth is complicated. If this documentary made you question why some stories never settle and why we demand they do, then it did its job. For more deep dive documentaries that explore the psychology behind fame, power, and unresolved legacies, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who believes every story must have a clean ending.